Good day. You are listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now bring you Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism with Roy Showman.
Hi, this is Roy Showman, and welcome once again to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism, the show on Radio Maria that celebrates the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, or seen the other way around, that celebrates the fulfillment, the completion, the full realization of all of the promise of Judaism in the Catholic Church and her sacraments. Well, I know it sounds corny for me to say, but I'm actually very excited about the topic of today's show, and I hope you'll forgive me my inadequacy to properly address the topic. But basically the topic is the following. It sounds like it's several different topics, but you'll see it's all woven together. It's the origin of the four Gospels. It is when they were written. It is in what language they were written, and how we know when they were written and in what language they were written, and what that has to do with Jesus being the Jewish Messiah and the Catholic Church being the continuation of Judaism after the coming of the Jewish Messiah. Because my intention during today's show is to establish, I am 100% convinced, of course being convinced is up to you, but I am 100% convinced that the four Gospels were all written within about 40 years of the crucifixion, and that at least the Synoptics, if not all four, at least the three first Gospels were actually written originally in Hebrew. I'm using the word Hebrew at the moment to include Aramaic, but were written in either Hebrew or Aramaic. But I actually think I can substantiate that they were written in literally Hebrew rather than Aramaic. And of course, that's only logical since Jesus was the Jewish Messiah and the first Christians were Jews. St. Peter was a Jew, St. Paul was a Jew. Matthew, Mark, and John were Jews. Luke was not, I believe. I believe that he was a Gentile. I could have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure, I know that he was a Greek. But in any case, that Luke was working from a Hebrew source when he wrote his gospel also. So anyway, that's kind of the outline for today's show. Now, why is this interesting? Why is it important? Well, if any of you have studied the topic at all in a conventional context, such as a normal college or university, or even seminary, including Catholic seminary, you will probably have been taught that the Gospels, including the first Gospel, could not possibly have been written before about 70 A.D., and generally one is taught that they were written perhaps between 120 and 150 A.D. In other words, somewhere around 90 to 150 years after the death of Jesus. This is very convenient for those who want to dismiss the truth of Jesus and the truth of the Gospels, and the truth of God, in fact. It fits in very well with the modernist, rationalist, there is nothing supernatural in the world point of view. Because obviously, if the story of Jesus was first written down 100 years after he died, there was plenty of time for it to become myths and lost in the mists of history, and for followers of his to exaggerate and then tell the story and it gets exaggerated even more and so forth. But if in fact they were written during the lifetime of people who had experience of Jesus and what he did, then, hey, wait a minute, they must be true, because otherwise the people who are hearing them would have known they're not true. They could no more be fictionalized than what's history of about 30 or 40 years ago, let's say, then the Reagan's administration could be fictionalized. So of course, if someone wants to dismiss Christianity, they almost are forced to say that the Gospels were written long after the death of Jesus, let's say. Furthermore, the Gospels, I think we all know, at least three of them, I'm not 100% sure about the Gospel according to John, but at least 3 of them foretell the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem happened about 70 AD. So obviously the Gospels must have been written after 70 AD, because how could Jesus have known that the temple was going to be destroyed? Unless, oh, wait a minute, he was God, in which case, of course, he would know the future. So you see again that if the Gospels really were written 10 or 20 or 30 years after the crucifixion, then there's a problem. It means that Jesus really knew the future. And, of course, the modern, contemporary, official party line narrative is that Jesus may have been a great leader, he may have been a great rabbi, he may have been this tremendous spiritual figure, but of course, he wasn't God incarnate. So anyway, that's all by way of background. So I am going to start. I'm going to start by reading a very beautiful essay by a Catholic biblical scholar, of French origin, who teaches in Belarus. And you'll see where I'm going, but she kind of summarizes the situation. Okay. Let's be straightforward. I believe the Gospels to be direct testimonies that tell real and non-mythic or symbolic facts. I do not believe in it because of my faith, but because I have rational, scientific, carefully researched reasons to do so. Indeed, we who affirm the absolute historicity of the Gospels are now only a small minority. Let's examine the different aspects of this situation. And by the way, I know this is true because I sat in at a Jesuit seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there was no question that the professors, very famous Jesuit Bible scholars, did not take the Bible seriously, did not take the truth of the Gospels in the way we would consider truth. And I actually had a fight. I fight a lot. I had a fight with a bishop in New England. I won't name where. And I had a fight with the head of a department at Boston College, a Catholic theologian at Boston College. And I had the same fight with both of them because I believed that Jesus literally resurrected from the tomb, and the tomb was empty. And both the bishop and this department head at Boston College argued that no, the disciples had some kind of subjective resurrection experience that led them to have faith in Jesus, but that it wasn't actually a physical resurrection. So what this author of this article is saying, I definitely know to be true. Continuing. Should the supernatural in the Gospels be simply denied? The resolution of differences regarding the dating, origins, authors, and nature of the Gospels lies in this interrogation. Should they be treated like any ordinary text for which the authenticity of the facts it contains is usually admitted? Or should they, by exception, be systematically denied what is in them, the supernatural, even when all other explanations have failed? In other words, and I think this is the heart of the matter, if Christianity is true, the supernatural aspects of the Gospels really happened. The miracles of Jesus really happened. The resurrection really happened. He really foretold the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It really happened. If one wants to think that stuff didn't happen, one has to say the Gospels are not historically true, and therefore they would not have been written by eyewitnesses of what happened, and they would not have been written during the lifetime of eyewitnesses of what had happened. Continuing. The oldest Gospels that have reached us are written in Greek, the international language during Christ's time. In the Holy Land, the commonly spoken language is Aramaic and the sacred language is Hebrew. Some specialists are convinced Hebrew was also spoken, while others think it was only written, but this does not matter. I'm going to interject something here. The foremost the world's foremost expert on the language of the Qumran scrolls, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, says the Dead Sea Scrolls establish without a doubt that Hebrew was the spoken language in that community. And for that reason and other reasons, he concludes that it is extremely unlikely that the Gospels, I have to step back a minute, both Hebrew and Aramaic are what's called Semitic languages. They come from, both Arabs and Jews are Semites. So they're both Semitic languages. There are people who think that the Gospels were, yes, written in Semitic language, but rather than being Hebrew, it was Aramaic. I will, if I have time in the show, say some of the very strong arguments why the evidence points to them having been written in Hebrew rather than Aramaic. Continuing. In AD 70, an event occurred that in both human and religious terms has been considered the most loathsome by Jews ever since that time, the fall and destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem by the Romans. Most of its inhabitants were killed, the rest were deported or scattered. Had the Gospels been written in Greek, it could have been at any time. They could have been written in 150 AD in Greek. But if, on the other hand, they were first written in Hebrew, it is almost inevitable that they would have been written before the destruction of the temple. Because after the destruction of the temple, there would have been no reason to write them in Hebrew, because there was no Hebrew-speaking community, so to speak. There was no Hebrew-speaking world. The Jews had been scattered, and they were living among non-Hebrew speakers. So the evidence that the Gospels were written in Hebrew or Aramaic would be indirect evidence that they were written before the fall of the temple. Continuing, if even one of the Gospels had been written before 70 AD, the witnesses of Christ's life, miracles, death, and resurrection, being still alive, would guarantee the authenticity of the account. They would have not let the deception go if the facts supposed to have happened among them had not taken place. On the other hand, if those four Gospels originated after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, all possible oversights, mistakes, forgeries, etc., intended additions or omissions may be considered. That is why the exegetes' discussion on both the date and the original language of the Gospels are so contentious. On these issues depend, indirectly but certainly, the degree of trust the Gospels can be granted. In other words, obviously, they are much more trustworthy if they were actually written by the eyewitnesses who claim to have written them. So, okay, now some of the evidence for how early they were written. Some 25 years ago, but this was written probably about 20 years ago, so sometime probably about 40 years ago, Father Jose O'Gallaghan, a Jesuit, identified a papyrus written in Greek which was found in cave number 7 in Qumran, as being a fragment of St. Mark's Gospel, and another papyrus from the same cave as being a fragment of 1 Timothy. Nobody has ever questioned the fact that these caves were closed and sealed up in 68 AD. Therefore, their content must be dated before that date of 68 AD. Okay, this is worth digesting. Nobody questions that the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran were hidden there and sealed up there in 68 AD. And yet, fragments of those scrolls can contain a passage from St. Mark's Gospel and another fragment from the same cave as being part of the first letter to Timothy. Therefore, the first letter to Timothy had been written before 68 AD, and St. Mark's Gospel, at least part of it, had been written before 68 AD. Then there are also many church, I shouldn't say many, but a number of church fathers who attested to the early date. I'll save that for later, actually. The early dates of the writing of the Gospels. I'll continue with the article that I'm reading for the moment. In addition to this archaeological evidence from the Qumran caves, we also have the philological, is that a word? I think it is a word, philological evidence. That is the study of words evidence. Concerning the philological research, two specialists thoroughly analyzed the language of the Gospels. Father Jean Carmignac, one of the greatest experts in biblical studies in the world, and recognized as foremost in the world in the knowledge of Qumran Hebrew, and Claude Trémonton, lecturer at the Institute of France, who taught at Sorbonne University. He's also the author of the Old Testament Hebrew to Greek dictionary. This is a little bit, they're both basically absolutely top world-class scholars, undoubtedly two of the top 6 or 8 scholars in the world with respect to the Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek and archaeology of Jesus' time. They both demonstrated that the Greek language used in the gospel, in the Gospels, all of the Gospels, was translated from Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, to be fair, Jean Carmignac did not address St. John's Gospel, so he only established that that the Greek of the Synoptic Gospels, Synoptic refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were originally written in Hebrew and translated into Greek. Trémonton also studied St. John's Gospel and came to the same conclusion for all 4 Gospels. They both established that they were translated from Hebrew or Aramaic. They both consider the whole of the Gospels. Well, I'll skip a few passages. Father Carmignac points out Semitisms of thought, vocabulary, syntax, style, composition, transmission, translation, and even multiple Semitisms. What is a Semitism? I hope to get to that today. Basically, they are things in the text of the Gospel that reflect Semitic language structure, Semitic vocabulary, Semitic writing and penmanship, actually, Semitic syntax, and so forth. In other words, the structure of sentences is not, for instance, just as an example, the structure of sentences in many cases is not a structure that would occur to a Greek speaker. The words are in the wrong order and so forth, and there are wrong forms used. However, it is the natural sentence structure for somebody speaking Hebrew. Anyway, we'll get to some of that, I hope. If not, some of it may have to wait for a later show. Who knows? For each case, he supplies many examples. Trémonton gives a few examples. We'll give a few examples from Trémonton. In Luke 9:51, chapter 9, verse 51, the Greek text reads, "He fixed his face to go to Jerusalem." This is Jesus. He fixed his face to go to Jerusalem, which is a pretty odd turn of phrase, and it makes no sense in Greek or English. However, it is a frequent phrase in the Old Testament in Hebrew, and it means he firmly decided. He firmly decided. You see, it's the normal Hebrew phrase for he firmly decided. And yet, in Greek and in English, it's a rather silly construction of the phrase. But if it was originally written in Hebrew, it would have been written, he fixed his face to go to Jerusalem. And then when a later translator translated it, he would have, if he wanted to respect the original language, he would have perhaps translated it word for word, coming up with, he fixed his face to go to Jerusalem. By the way, as an aside, this is a very common situation because Hebrew is very, very poor in abstractions. It uses physical, concrete things to represent abstractions. It's very typical. For instance, in Hebrew does not say in his presence. Hebrew says before his face. When Moses met God, for instance, on the top of Mount Sinai, he wasn't in the presence of God. He was in front of the face of God. Face is something physical and concrete, and you can be in the front of it. Presence is a more abstract concept. So the fact that Hebrew would say, in order to express the thought he firmly decided, would use the words he fixed his face, is very typical of Hebrew. Anyway, Tremonton gives many such examples and idiomatic expressions. He also points out the following passage in St. John, chapter 5, verse 2. St. John's text being regarded as the latest and most recent of the four Gospels. In other words, it's the newest of the four Gospels. That St. John says there is in Jerusalem, next to the sheep gate, a pool called Bethesda. He uses the present tense. There is in Jerusalem, not there was in Jerusalem. If it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, it would have been more correct to say there was in Jerusalem rather than there is in Jerusalem. Similarly, Jesus, of course, predicts the destruction of the temple. I mentioned that. But Tremonton points out something else, which is if, in fact, the Gospels were written after the destruction of the temple, it would have been very natural for the authors, when they quote Jesus as saying before the destruction of the temple that it would be destroyed, if they then pointed out, and verily this came about. In other words, if they then said, and see, Jesus prophesied this correctly, it was destroyed. They don't do that. They don't say that the prophecy came true. Tremonton concludes from this that it's most likely that it was written before it came true. As Tremonton calls it, whoever forged the Gospels would have been a very shy and discreet forger, not to make that boast. Anyway, so therefore, Tremonton concluded that even the Gospel of John, according to John, which is the latest of the Gospels, cannot have been written after 70 A.D. Carmignac also explains some rather nonsensical passages in the Gospels. For instance, in Mark 5:13, there is a reference to a herd of 2,000 pigs. Those are the swine that were, when Jesus exorcised the demoniac, he cast the demons, who were legion, into herds of swine, who then ran into the sea. And in Mark's Gospel, the Greek says that that it was 2,000 pigs that ran into the sea. Now, you can't have a herd of 2,000 pigs, number one, and number two, it's pretty deserty and the grass is very sparse. You just would not have had a herd of 2,000 pigs, even if herds of 2,000 pigs existed. However, in Hebrew, only consonants are written down. There are no vowels written down. And without the vowels, the word for 2,000 is exactly the same as to say herds. So it's very logical that the underlying Hebrew said herds of pigs cast themselves into the sea, and when the person translating it from Hebrew into Greek saw that word written, he took it to be another word which would have been spelled the same way, which means 2,000. Anyway, okay. Father Carmignac gives many more examples, and as I have time, I will mention others. I just mention a couple of really fun ones. There are many little details in the Gospels which would have been known to people at the time of Jesus who lived in the place where Jesus lived, but would not have been known by people 100 years later who lived elsewhere. And by the way, there were no no Jews or Christians living in, around Jerusalem 100 years later, that's for sure. So there are all these passages in the Gospels which reflect really precise local contemporaneous knowledge. Okay, for instance, I'll just give a few lists of these and then I will take a short break. And by the way, despite the fact that I'm talking a mile a minute, this is a call-in show. It is a live call-in show. And if there are any callers, any people who wish to call in, the number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY, M-A-R-Y. And in a couple of minutes, I'll take a short musical break. And that's an excellent time to call because then coming out of the break, I can just go to the call board. Anyway, so I'll just give a couple of examples. In 1968, archaeologists commissioned by the Israeli government excavated north of Jerusalem the remains of a young man, 5.5 feet tall, dating from the 1st century, who had been crucified and whose tibia had been broken. In other words, whose legs had been broken. He was crucified and his legs had been broken. Just like the Gospels say that Jesus was crucified and then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the other crucified men so they would die more quickly. That's one local historical fact that it's unlikely that people would have known 100 years later in Rome or something, or who knows where. Number 2, a stone found just a few years ago was found in the remains, notifying non-Jews that they were not allowed inside the temple reserved to the Jews. Now that stone that told non-Jews they were not allowed inside the temple, part of the temple reserved for the Jews, was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, just like the inscription above the cross was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And finally, a family grave dating back to Jesus' time was uncovered in a graveyard where leading citizens were buried. It contained the remains of a certain Simon of Cyrene's parents. Okay? Big coincidences. Now, let me see if I'm going to continue here. Oh yeah, this is the last one. No, there are 2 more. I can't resist. There are 2 more of these archaeological proofs, so to speak, or specific local knowledge proofs that the Gospels were written by the people who, for the first 1800 years of the church, everyone assumed had written them and had been attested to from the very first centuries to have written them. So anyway, here goes. When Pilate speaks Greek in St. John's Gospel is written in Greek, right? And Pilate is speaking Greek in the Gospel, but but remember, Pilate's not a native Greek speaker. He is a Roman. He's a native Latin speaker. When he speaks Greek in St. John's Gospel, he speaks it as a foreigner, making mistakes and Latinisms. In other words, turns of phrase that were correct in Latin but not in Greek, whereas the remainder of St. John's Gospel is grammatically perfect Greek. Who would have remembered this long after the facts? In other words, whoever wrote St. John's Gospel knew that when Pilate was speaking in Greek, he made mistakes in the Greek because he wasn't that good at Greek. Anyway, on another matter, and this is the last one that I'll mention before the break, St. Mark's Gospel tells us that Jesus, during the storm he was about to calm, was inside the stern of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. Now, of course, in the English translations, very often they gloss over these awkward turns of phrase, so to speak, because they want to make it sound correct. But the Greek says not that Jesus was at the stern of the boat, sleeping on a cushion, but he was inside the stern of the boat, sleeping on the cushion. This wouldn't make much sense until very recently, when in 1986, the wreck of a boat of Jesus' time was found in the Sea of Galilee. And on its rear deck, there was a covered shelter in which a man could lie. In other words, this 2,000-year-old boat that was found in the Sea of Galilee had a covered deck on the stern that you could lie inside of and sleep on a cushion. Now, who would have known that if they weren't around at the time of Jesus? Because even if they were, Jews in Rome 100 years later, the whole story of Israel, the whole story of the Jews in Jerusalem and around the Sea of Galilee and so forth, that was ancient history by then. There wouldn't have been any people around who knew what the fishing boats on the Sea of Galilee used to look like. So with that, I'm going to go to a musical break and catch my breath and invite you to call, if anyone wishes to call, with comments or questions. You're listening to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with me, your host, Roy Showman, on Radio Maria. And the call-in number here is 866-333-6279. Or if you use Skype, it's Radio Maria USA Studio on Skype. And with that, I'll go to the music, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. But I will want to make a little caveat. If you call with a question, don't... I'll do my best, but I am not a super expert on what I'm talking about. So, my knowledge in general is a mile wide and 2 inches deep, so it won't be hard to stump me if you ask a extremely erudite kind of question. You're welcome to ask. You may just get the answer, what a good question, I wish I knew. But in any case, if you wish to call, 866-333-6279. And now what I'm about to play, by the way, is the Our Father sung in Aramaic.
Abund bashmayu netekada sheshenoch tivem malekutoch
Whoops. I'm back. Sorry for that glitch. And let me see if there have been any calls that came in.
Oh, this is Greg.
Oh, hi. Okay, great. Did you have a question or a comment or a complaint?
No, just a question, a little bit off target per se for your subject, but when during the Last Supper, Jesus says that he shall never again drink the new wine until he's in heaven, I believe, right?
He says he'll never drink
then,
the fruit of the vine. Yeah.
Okay. Which is, I mean, I assumed I was referring to wine, correct? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then when he's dying on the cross, they give him a sprig. They take a sprig of hyssop and they soak it in the rancid wine, and he drinks it. I'm just question. Could you shed some light on that for me? I'm a little lost on that.
Nope, I can't. I'm sorry. It's a good question.
Oh.
I warned you guys, right, that it's easy to stump me. I know what Scott Hahn says about it. I've read different things about whether it was vinegar or it was wine. I've heard a number of theories, but I am not either expert or sufficiently overwhelmingly convinced of one theory versus another to wish to stick my neck out.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah, that's
Thank
right. Scott Hahn, he has a talk that you can find on the internet called The Fourth Cup, which is all about exactly that, a saying of Jesus at the Last Supper, that he won't drink the fruit of the vine again until he drinks it new in the kingdom. So you could do a lot worse than, he also, I think, may even have a book called The Fourth Cup. You do a lot worse than seeing what Scott Hahn has to say.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate
Sure.
it.
And then we have a second caller, I think, Aiden.
Oh, hello?
Hello? Yeah? Did you have a question or a comment?
Okay. Yeah, I do. I sent you an email a while ago, so I just want to say thank you, and I do have a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, sure.
So I just applied to Franciscan, and before I applied, I was doing a lot of research on it, and I heard of the ring by spring thing, the culture, they put a lot of emphasis on marriage, and I thought that was really weird because I'm coming from more of a secular background, so I thought it was really different because from a secular background, I've never heard of that.
What do you mean they put a lot of emphasis on marriage?
Yeah, to get married before they graduate, when they attend. I don't know if you've heard about that.
So you found that weird. I'll tell you why I think. Why they do that. I don't know so much about
secular background, I guess. But I just haven't heard of that before.
Well, my wife teaches at Ave Maria, which is a similarly Catholic university. And one of the reasons that I think they do that is because it is a pool of very serious Catholics who take their faith very seriously. Probably, 90% of the students at Steubenville are no-holds-barred Catholics. They may be traditionalists, they may be charismatics, but they're serious Catholics. At Ave Maria, almost all of the students who aren't there for the sports, which is another problem, are there because they want a seriously Catholic environment. So it's a tremendous pool from which to find a spouse, and it allows one to get to know other students fairly well before you start, dating or taking somebody seriously. Once you're out in the world, where are you going? Where can you go where more than 5% of the people are serious Catholics or 10% of the people are serious Catholics?
Yeah.
Especially around the right age.
Yeah.
You go to my parish, there are plenty of serious Catholics, but very few are under 65.
Yeah, I noticed that when I go to church, I'm the only kid there.
Yeah. So.
So I also heard there's a problem where there I guess there's not much dating because I guess they're scared to ask girls out. Is there a reason why that is?
No, I don't know about that. Although I will say it's always a good policy to have a way of getting to know members of the opposite sex outside of a dating relationship, before a dating relationship, if you see what I mean. Because a dating relationship kind of by definition puts a lot of pressure on and a lot of expectations and so forth.
Yeah, okay. I was just kind of, it was just, I had never heard of that before because from like a secular background,
Hmm.
like most people just go to college to like get a degree. Like, I think if they meet someone they want to marry there, that's like more, that's kind of like in the back of their mind. It's not like a, you know what I mean?
Well,
Like, it's
you're a
something
guy.
that,
I assume you're a guy. I know you're a guy.
yeah.
You're a guy, so, if you meet somebody 10 years after college, it's not so bad. But half the
Yeah.
students there are women. And being serious Catholics, many of them are probably looking forward to starting a family. And so if they meet a guy 10 years out of college, they're already in a less ideal situation.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I heard women typically don't want to, I guess, date someone who with. I guess I think I read a study saying that women like to date men with at least like the same educational background, if not higher. So it seems like this is I guess a small group of men they would be interested in, or like would
Well,
be,
I'm sorry.
I guess,
I,
they prefer.
I think you called the wrong show for dating advice. So with your forbearance, I'm going to go back to the history of the
Okay,
Gospels, if you
sorry.
don't mind.
I went a little off topic. I just never heard of it before.
Okay, no problem. But let me get back to
Thank
the
you.
Gospels.
All right,
Thank you. Thanks for the call. Okay, now I am kind of running out of time, so I'm going to go to very early church fathers, some of them apostolic fathers, who know when the Gospels were written or make reference to when the Gospels were written. So I think this is more or less chronological order. Irenaeus, who was the bishop of Lyon, and in around 180 AD, he said the following: Matthew published a scripture which is a gospel for the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were evangelizing at Rome and founding the church. Okay, so Irenaeus says that the gospel according to Matthew was written in Hebrew while Matthew was still in Palestine, and while Peter and Paul were evangelizing at Rome. So that pretty much dates it. Then Pontanus is actually he was he went to the Indies. He went to India, and this sounds pretty bizarre, but there is evidence that Christianity spread to India during the lives of the apostles. So anyway, Pontanus went to India, and he found that before he arrived in India, the Gospel of Matthew was present among the inhabitants of the land, and that because Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had been there preaching, and he left them the work of Matthew in Hebrew. And then where is the most famous is Saint Jerome. Let me see if I can quickly find. Well, maybe I can't even find Saint Jerome, so I'll skip Saint Jerome for now. Clement of Alexandria, who was born about 150 A.D., he wrote the following: As for Mark, then during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings, not telling them all, but selecting those he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. So here we have St. Clement of Alexandria saying that during Peter's stay in Rome, which means before Peter's crucifixion, of course, Mark was in Rome and wrote an account of the Lord's doings. And then Origen, who was born in 185 A.D., he wrote the following: As I have learned by tradition concerning the four Gospels, which alone are unquestionable in the Church of God under heaven, the first written was that according to Matthew, who was once a tax collector, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it for those who came to believe from Judaism composed as it was in the Hebrew language. The second gospel is that according to Mark, who wrote it in accordance with Peter's instructions. And then Eusebius, who wrote the ecclesiastical history about 300 AD, wrote, Matthew had first preached to Hebrews, and when he was on the point of going to others, he transmitted in writing, in his native language, the gospel according to himself, and thus supplied by writing the lack of his own presence to those to whom he was sent. That's the end of the quote from Eusebius. About 20 other later patristic testimonies, among which are those of St. Epiphanius and St. Jerome, affirm that Matthew had written his gospel in Hebrew. So there is plenty of evidence that the Gospels were written in Hebrew, some think in Aramaic, and that they were written by people who were around during the life of Jesus and written shortly after the crucifixion. In fact, the dating of the Gospels I have here. Now, this is from a church council. Let me find the dating. Always happens. So, here it is. Okay, so there was a church council granted that it was in the ninth century. It was in 836, but they were referring to older documents in that council, and that they said that the St. Matthew's Gospel was written 8 years after the ascension of the Lord. So that's about 40 AD, 8 years after the crucifixion. St. Mark's 11 years after the crucifixion. St. Luke's 15 years, and St. John's 32 years after the crucifixion. So St. John's would have been the last written, and would have been written about, about 62 to 65 AD. So that is really the bottom line. That's really the bottom line. Now, it gets very difficult to explain. Let me think of. I'm not going to try to explain the philological evidence in 3 minutes for the Gospels having been written in Hebrew rather than in Aramaic. I will quote Father René Laurentin, who is a tremendously prestigious Catholic scholar. He considers that the best possible solution to problems with the structure and theology of Luke is the recognition of these chapters as the translation from Hebrew and not from Aramaic. He uncovers frequent Hebraic allusions, which are Hebraicisms of composition, but not, in other words, they're reflections of Hebrew in the composition, not reflections of Aramaic in the composition. In other words, they're like stylistic elements that you find in Hebrew in the composition, which don't exist in Aramaic. And Pinchas Lapide, who was an Israeli scholar and the director of the government press office in Jerusalem and a professor, he actually wrote a very positive book about Pius XII, by the way, but I'm not here to talk about that. He wrote a number of publications such as Hidden Hebrew in the Gospels and so forth. And he wrote, quote, "There is a goodly number of further hidden Hebraicisms lurking within the web of the synoptic texture." Anyway, I could go on and on and on and on, but I have come to the end of the hour. So I have been drawing largely from a book called The Birth of the Synoptics but I think you've gotten a flavor. I think I've been able to convey the purpose of why I've been doing this. And remember when you hear the Gospels read in church, right, every Sunday, maybe even more often than that, you're hearing them read in English. The tendency is to think that they're translations from the Greek. But think of what it would feel like if you realized they were translations from the Hebrew. Because the people who wrote the Gospels wrote in Hebrew. The people who witnessed the life of Jesus were Jews who were speaking Hebrew, writing Hebrew. The accounts of Jesus' life and death were originally all in Hebrew, because the church is post-Messianic Judaism. The church is the continuation of Judaism, the transformation of Judaism after the coming of the Jewish Messiah. So what is more logical and almost inevitable that the sacred scriptures of the Old Testament should be written in Hebrew, and the sacred scriptures of the New Testament, reflecting their Hebrew-speaking Messiah, Jesus, should also have been originally written in Hebrew. So with that, I've come to the end of my time. You've been listening to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria with me, your host, Roy Schoeman. I hope even if you didn't follow all of the logic of all of the Semiticisms in the Gospels, you follow the theme, which is there's no need to believe the modernist, dismissive, rationalist poo-pooing of the truth of the faith. The science supports the truth of the faith. Science does not contradict the truth of the faith. That is the case if you're looking at evolution. That's the case if you're looking at the Shroud of Turin. That's the case if you're looking at the description of the crucifixion and the real medical science under crucifixion. And it's the truth if you're looking at the history of the Gospels. We have nothing to be, there is no contradiction between science, historical evidence, archaeology, linguistics, philology, and the traditional truths of the faith. So with that, it's time to say goodbye, and consistent with the theme of the show, I'm going to go out playing once again the Our Father, sung beautifully in Aramaic. This is Roy Schoeman saying goodbye for now. I hope you join me again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now.
I can't